permanent supportive housing training. Today we have Katie Joe with the Grand Forks Housing Authority. Just one more announcement during the presentation, please keep your microphones and your videos off. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box and we will answer them as the presenter goes along. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm turning it over to you, Katie.
Great, thank you. Hi everybody, welcome to today's session. I'm thrilled to be here and talk about permanent supportive housing. As Kylie mentioned, my name is Katie Jo Armbrust and I work for the Grand Forks Housing Authority. For the last 2 years, I've been the project director of a 5-year, $2.5 million SAMHSA grant. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Agency. It's out of the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. This grant provides funding for wraparound support services for people who are either experiencing or at risk of homelessness that also have a behavioral health condition. Behavioral health conditions such as mental health condition, substance use disorder, or co-occurring disorders. Our grant focuses on housing, and in particular, supportive housing, as a primary way to address people who are experiencing homelessness. There we go. Okay, so previous to my current position, I was very fortunate to be part of the development team for LaGrave on First. That's the big, beautiful building in the middle there. One of our longtime partners and nonprofits, Grand Forks Homes, Inc., built this 4-story apartment complex. It has 42 one-bedroom, one-bathroom units on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors, 9 of which are fully accessible. All of these fully furnished units are designated to those who were determined by our community as the most vulnerable, people experiencing chronic homelessness. For those of you that don't know, these are individuals who have a disabling condition. For the vast majority, it is a behavioral health condition, and have experienced either 12 months or 12 months of consecutive homelessness or 4 episodes in the past 3 years that total 4 or more, or total 12 or more months of homelessness. In order to fill these units, we utilize the North Dakota Continuum of Care's coordinated entry system, which I'll go over in depth later. The first floor of this building, so when you walk in, the picture on your top left, that is the entryway. That whole first floor is dedicated to tenant amenities. On the top right, you can kind of see we have a community room. In addition, we have a computer room, a laundry room that includes free laundry for tenants, an exercise room, commercial kitchen and dining room, as well as administrative space for all of the services that are provided on site. LaGrave on First offers 24/7 housing support staff, 2 of which are funded through the SAMHSA grant I administer. We also have a full-time nurse case manager. She's funded through Altru Health System. We have an employment specialist and housing case manager, both of which are funded by the SAMHSA grant, as well as additional supports that are coordinated on a weekly or monthly basis. Those additional supports are things like we have volunteers come in and provide meals for tenants in the evening. That's something that our community was interested in doing, and we've been very fortunate that almost, or now over 2 years later, we still have going and now have it on an every night basis. In addition to our nurse that's on site 40 hours a week, Altru also provides a team of doctors that come in every other Wednesday for a few hours to do exams on tenants right there in the building. When we were designing it, we set up an exam room to be included, and we were very fortunate that Altru has continued to provide those services. So, what is permanent supportive housing? Why are we here today? Permanent supportive housing is an evidence-based model to help people who struggle to live completely independently in the community. It truly pairs safe, decent, affordable housing with voluntary support services to help keep people housed. So permanent supportive housing allows people to remain in the community where they likely want to be, rather than requiring a higher level of care that is not necessary for them to be successful, such as being in the state hospital, nursing home, or group home, etc. I will note quickly that we've actually had a couple of tenants who did move in and had, clearly been experiencing chronic homelessness prior. And so with staff able to, chat with them and get to know them, staff noticed that they needed a higher level of care. So we did have an individual who, prior to moving into LaGrave on First, when he was out in the community, people would have thought that his substance use disorder was the reason he acted the way he did. But once he moved into LaGrave on First, staff were able to recognize that he actually had behaviors that occurred when he wasn't drinking. And they were able to determine that he actually had dementia and Alzheimer's. And so our staff were able to assist him with transitioning to a basic care or nursing home. For me, I really do like to think of assisted living and permanent supportive housing being very similar, because when I was in college, I was a CNA at an assisted living facility, and they're incredibly similar. At an assisted facility or assisted living facility, people rent an apartment and they have access to a la carte services as they choose. They don't have to use the services available in order to live there. They can stay there as long as they would like, as long as they're paying rent and things are going well. That's what assisted living is. And the same goes for permanent supportive housing. You pay 30% of your gross monthly income toward rent, and you don't have to utilize any of the services, even though they are available to you. So how does permanent supportive housing work? There's a few different factors to it. So the first thing is single site, meaning one property has all of its units designated to those in need of permanent supportive housing. Perfect example being LaGrave on First. So as you see, or I talked about, that all of the apartment units and the services are literally within the same building, meaning single site. Scattered site, on the other hand, is preferable because it allows for tenant choice. It's just like utilization of a housing choice voucher, where the tenant goes out and chooses a unit within the community that meets fair market rent and all those standards. And then the services actually meet that person in their home, or they can coordinate, meeting at a coffee shop, etc. But that's scattered site is actually utilized over 70% of permanent supportive housing programs across the country. The tenant signs a lease, and so this is a big thing here because it has the protections, rights, and responsibilities for both the person and the property manager or owner. So the normal lease, a standard lease, is utilized, typically 12 months. Some agencies do use 6 months. And then another thing that we have not tapped into here in North Dakota that I'm aware of is the use of a master lease. And so this is used by different agencies in the country kind of as a tool, and a tool to protect those that they serve in case of failure. So one of the hard parts is, just because somebody has an opportunity to live in a housing unit at LaGrave on First doesn't mean they're going to succeed at LaGrave on First. So other agencies use this, and it's actually quite preferable for some of them when thinking about the barriers to housing, especially when one of those is having a poor rental history, such as a recent eviction. So another thing I should mention is that with LaGrave on First, we have had our property owner, Grand Forks Homes Inc., significantly reduce the barriers or the eligibility criteria in order to get housed at LaGrave on First. So when someone comes up for tenancy, we're overlooking things like credit history or rental history, even if it's from within properties that we manage, as well as debts owed. We do this because we recognize the individuals who need housing the most have historically maybe been people who have had the worst experience as being a tenant. We believe that we definitely believe that people's past don't have to determine their future. And all of this rides on the teamwork between the tenant, the service provider, and the property manager. Like, truly, communication is all of our best friends to make sure we're all on the same page. And that at the end of the day, the goal here is definitely to keep people housed when it is safe to do so. And services. Tenants do utilize services available. So you might think, if I don't make services mandatory, they're not going to participate in this. But that's not been the case with a lot of the programs across the country, as well as what we've seen at LaGrave on First over the last 2 years since we've been open. Those services are voluntary for the tenant. They are not voluntary for the service provider. This is really where assertive engagement comes into play. Services are there to build relationships, trust, and provide multiple ongoing opportunities for tenants to participate. So when it comes to services, the belief and practice of what's called harm reduction is truly the secret sauce in helping tenants remain housed. We'll talk about this more later, but harm reduction is simply setting up obtainable actions to negate the harm associated with risky behavior. Excuse me. And tenants remain housed. So studies show, tenancy rates as high as 98% for those who live in permanent supportive housing. The key to people staying housed is truly the services that are offered, the way they are offered, and the lower barriers to getting people housed. This is something I've become incredibly passionate about, especially when we look at ourselves as North Dakota compared to other states that are even very similar. Permanent supportive housing isn't a brand new idea. It's not shiny and new. We know it works, and I'm very grateful that we are expanding permanent supportive housing in North Dakota and have been able to demonstrate its success with LaGrave on First. Okay. Why utilize permanent supportive housing? So the three overall arches are, yes, it increases success. Supportive housing improves housing stability, employment, mental and physical health, and school attendance for families with children, and it reduces active substance use. So people in supportive housing live more stable and productive lives. This is kind of one of those moments where I'm like, this should be no surprise. If you're somebody who's experiencing like long-term chronic homelessness, or even short-term, your life is currently fairly chaotic and you are in crisis. Every night you are thinking about where you're going to lay your head at night. You're concerned about your belongings, where your next meal is going to come from. So by providing supportive housing, of course, lives stabilize because they have a place to go. In regards to this, there's a lot of studies that indicate these successes, and actually with the University of North Dakota and Ultra Health System, we have a study going on right now for LaGrave on First. It's actually a 5-year study to look at both the qualitative and quantitative aspects or impacts of the project. We did just receive the first year of the report, but I'm not able to share it publicly just yet. But it does confirm that people do better when they're housed at LaGrave on First. And again, part of me thinks like, oh shit, like, of course they're doing better. They were homeless and now they're housed. But there's definitely a learning curve to that. People who have been literally unsheltered have some relearning to do. Some of the basic daily living skills that you and I take for granted because we've always had a place to call home. Those things need to be relearned for a lot of the folks that live with us at LaGrave on First. Things like, just how to keep your apartment tidy. Remembering the importance of paying your rent on time. how to navigate if you think you're going to be late on rent, or if your income increases and decreases. All of those changes, there's definitely a learning curve there. But all of that being said, it's definitely working in Grand Forks like it does across the country. So we're very grateful for that. Cost effectiveness. So our study for the first year is really focusing on the qualitative impact, but permanent supportive housing has shown in several studies to cost less, but for sure no more than that of keeping people homeless and stuck in the revolving door of high cost crisis care and emergency housing. So like simply put, housing people costs less than the use of hospital or jail. And it's a better use of resources. Having individuals go to the emergency room because they're really in need of a place to stay for the evening, somewhere warm, or they need a meal. The emergency room isn't the best place for them, right? That's for emergency medical care. So by providing housing, we're addressing the homelessness. And benefits to the community. So supportive housing helps build strong, healthy communities by improving the safety of neighborhoods, beautifying city blocks with new or rehab properties, and increase or stabilizing property values over time. So when we were first developing LaGrave on First, we had neighbors with concerns about their property values, and rightfully so. As a homeowner, I totally understand that. So we did some research and looked at other projects in the country that had also done some research on that, and they actually found that permanent supportive housing projects stabilized and or increased property values. And this should also not be too much of a surprise, because when you think about it, taking an old building that's dilapidated and rehabbing it, or taking a neglected parcel of land and building something like LaGrave on First, that's beautiful, and it's going to be there for the long run. All right, 1 second here. All right, so who lives in permanent supportive housing? So you can all read, I hope. Aging adults, child welfare involved families, like LaGrave on First, individuals who've experienced chronic homelessness, individuals who are justice involved, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and that transitional age group, ages 18 to 24 years old. So, supportive housing is, like I said in the beginning, for those who are obviously lacking housing and may have complex needs, or might not do so well in the community without some extra support. So in Grand Forks, we have some permanent supportive housing, but it's fairly limited when we think big picture. So LaGrave on First, we started, I think it was almost 6 years ago now. The discussions were already in play when I got involved around, what are the housing and service needs in our community? Who's the most vulnerable? What population is not being served? And the community, dozens of organizations came around the table and said, we have a group of individuals who are experiencing homelessness that are sticking around and have been here for a while. The things that we currently have to offer are clearly not working. So our community agreed and decided that, we need to do something to address people experiencing chronic homelessness in our community. So we were super fortunate to have funding come in from Money Follows the Person, low-income housing tax credits, housing trust fund, all kinds of different resources that helped us not only do a study to determine, yes, this is a need in our community, and to confirm that things like housing first and permanent supportive housing were the appropriate ways to address it. But that, that process really led us to the development of LaGrave on First. And LaGrave on First is great and wonderful and super happy to have it, but that's the only option we have right now in our community for people who've experienced chronic homelessness. And while it is a fabulous option, slightly biased there, but ideally, we should have a lot more opportunities or options for people. So scattered site housing or scattered site permanent supportive housing is definitely something that we have our eye on as services increase and meeting people where they're at. So we have LaGrave on First for individuals experiencing chronic homelessness. And then we have the Housing Authority manages another property called Winterland that is for families with children that have experienced homelessness. And then we have a couple of other agencies in town that are providing housing and services for those with developmental disabilities or mental health conditions. Each region in our state is different. In Grand Forks, we don't have much / anything for youth. And obviously Fargo has a lot more resources and a higher population. So they have permanent supportive housing that caters to several different populations. But we definitely have the opportunity to increase permanent supportive housing across our state. And that's something I'll talk a little bit more about here in the next couple of slides. But first and foremost, housing first and permanent supportive housing. So housing first is the approach endorsed by the federal government, I believe under the Bush administration, George W., to end homelessness by offering immediate permanent housing without prerequisites like participation in treatment or services. And then you offer voluntary services. Housing First also works well with another housing model called rapid rehousing. So similar-ish to permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing provides just short-term rental assistance and short-term case management for those who aren't in need as high of level of services or assistance as those in permanent support housing. So by providing a safe place to live, Housing First allows tenants to stabilize and take opportunities to utilize available services. Some of the core elements I don't have on the screen, but I'll read them off to you quick. Some of those core elements of Housing First, they include things like the admission or tenant screening and selection practices actually promote the acceptance of applicants, regardless of their sobriety or use of substances, regardless of their completion of treatment, and regardless of their participation in services while they live there. Applicants are seldom rejected on the basis of poor credit or financial history, poor or lack of rental history, minor criminal convictions, or behaviors that indicate a lack of housing readiness. Housing would accept referrals directly from shelters, street outreach, drop-in centers, and other parts of the crisis response system frequented by vulnerable people experiencing homelessness. Support services emphasize engagement and problem solving over therapeutic goals. I'll say this real quick, that what you and I think somebody's goal needs to be or what they need to do in order to stay housed might not be their goal on any given day. And so we really need to focus on the fact that our opinions don't really matter some days. And by providing support and addressing the goal or concern of someone else's in that moment, not only builds trust and accountability, but it can also address one item so that they can get or move on to that bigger item, what you and I might be thinking of, like, hey, you gotta get your rent paid, or wow, you really need to clean up your apartment. So service plans are highly tenant driven without predetermined goals. Participation in services or program compliance is not a condition of permanent supportive housing tenancy. And then use of alcohol or drugs in and of itself without other lease violations is not considered a reason for eviction. We do have lease violations that occur at LaGrave on First, and our property manager definitely lets tenants know when they've violated a lease. That's something that staff work really hard to kind of mitigate, or help the tenant understand the difference, or not the difference, but what's occurring and what is and is not acceptable. Like I talked about before, that learning curve is real, and that's exactly why support services are there. One other thing I've definitely learned is that there is no such thing as being housing ready. Like, anybody who's experiencing homelessness is ready for a freaking place to live, right? They're ready to have a place to call their own. So the quickest way to end homelessness is by providing housing and services. But there is a concept of document readiness, and that's why we advocate so much for robust services that help people navigate our often ridiculously difficult systems to obtain proper identification, so that the housing authority has all of those in line. One other thing I should definitely note is that housing first shouldn't be a program specific concept, or it shouldn't only be, I should say, a program specific concept. Like I was kind of alluding to before, we're having that problem now in Grand Forks where LaGrave on First is the only housing first property, whereas ideally you should have a community approach to housing first, or if you're not going to have a single site permanent supportive housing, we should have scattered site supportive housing. But as we, the Grand Forks Housing Authority, have learned time and time again, it really is both lowering the barriers to housing, but also like really, really good services that help people change and stay in their units. Like I mentioned before, unfortunately, housing first doesn't mean that the first time a person is housed after they've experienced chronic homelessness or homelessness in general, that it's going to work out. Housing first means that you are working with this individual or family, even if it takes more than 2 or 3 units to find the right fit. If LaGrave on First doesn't work for somebody, we should be able to try another unit and provide those same supports to them in order for them to be successfully housed. So again, having the right services and service providers help demonstrate to people that they're there, their support system, and that they're there for the long haul is incredibly, incredibly important. So harm reduction. I mentioned this a couple times before in regards to how it is incredibly important to the success of a housing first approach. So no harm reduction. It's not opposed to sobriety or treatment, anything like that. Harm reduction does not mean that we condone risky behaviors, or that we think a substance use disorder isn't scary or important to address. But harm reduction does mean accepting that sometimes people are going to engage in risky behaviors. And so, how do we address those harmful consequences to improve the lives of the person and the people around them? What are the obtainable ways to mitigate those, right? One of the best ways, in my thought, or for me, to think about harm reduction is during some conference I was told, okay, you drive a vehicle 75 plus miles per hour on the interstate. That is risky if your vehicle randomly loses control, or in North Dakota, if a deer jumps out of the ditch. So one way we mitigate those risks is by wearing a seatbelt. We reduce the likelihood of those harmful consequences. That's harm reduction. Similarly, we utilize harm reduction to work with people who have a substance use disorder. Maybe they're not quite ready for treatment or sobriety. Harm reduction works in an oversimplified way by using the basics of, hey, Joe, can you drink a 12-pack of beers rather than a liter of vodka or whiskey? You and I do these same things in our lives every day, right? We know some alcohols get to us a little bit more than others. It's really not that much different for people with behavioral health conditions. Same thing with, that if you eat a good full meal before you go out for the evening, that you're less likely to consume as much. We use those same practices when working with the tenants at LaGrave on First. Things like, instead of drinking at 8 a.m., could we wait until 1 p.m. or 6 p.m.? And can we make sure to have that full meal beforehand? Those are all very simple examples of harm reduction. Okay, so tell me more about those services since they're so darn important. Um, as I've likely mentioned multiple times by now, they are not required in order for people to become housed or stay housed. Um, they really should be voluntary, supportive, and ongoing. Um, you know, depending on what the person or family needs, you can see one or more of these services offered. Um, and the services I've offered are listed out here, like care coordination, um, peer support, supported employment, supported housing, supported education. Um, these are things that are actually included in what's called the Medicaid 1915I State Plan Amendment. Um, Not that any of you are super familiar with that, but it is something our state, during the last legislative session, approved our North Dakota Department of Human Services to apply for the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. The 1915I allows for individuals who are on Medicaid to be assessed and deemed eligible for home and community-based services. So this is in particular for individuals with behavioral health conditions or a traumatic brain injury. And they have to, go through eligibility criteria that includes a couple of things that I won't get into detail here, but like a HUDAS score and all of this fun stuff. And that's not something that you would necessarily know about your tenant, but in the future here, that's something that your tenants may be eligible for. So the North Dakota Department of Human Services initially submitted the application at the end of April, and it is something that has been, they're going back and forth in their discussions and negotiations right now. So DHS has not received final approval from CMS yet, but that's something they anticipate in the next couple of months, I believe, and including the rollout of these services. Things like supported housing and peer support, supported employment, etc. These are, services that have not historically been available to people with behavioral health conditions. They've been vastly left out to fend for themselves without those services. Typically, you would have needed a developmental disability or a physical disability to receive some sort of assistance. Behavioral health conditions are kind of the tougher ones because they manifest in fairly socially awkward behaviors, and sometimes, those can be difficult to navigate. But with the appropriate service providers and training in place, we're able to provide all these kinds of support services to help keep people housed. And so while you think of supported employment as, yes, helping somebody obtain and maintain and train for a job, that employment is also incredibly important to people staying or remaining housed. It gives them a sense of self-worth and purpose and accountability and routine, etc. Same thing with supported education, as well as peer supports. North Dakota has been doing a lot of great work around peer supports the last few years, and so this is just one more way to have sustainable funding for peer supports for this population. Included in this, so at the end of the slide there, it shows you the link for more information on the Medicaid 1959 State Plan Amendment. But another area we're working on as the Grand Forks Housing Authority is bringing in the Corporation for Supportive Housing. They are a national nonprofit that's amazing and do everything related to supportive housing, from training and advocacy to lending and policy work. They help agencies all over the United States that have traditionally provided behavioral health services through grant funding transition to Medicaid billing operations. So the idea with this is that we would bring Corporation for Supportive Housing in and increase the number of agencies across our state that are able to provide those services that you see listed here under the 1959 State Plan Amendment. This would create a substantially better and more robust system of supports for people with behavioral health conditions. And the goal of that, even for DHS, is to allow choice in your service provider. Just because you have a good or a bad experience at one agency or one provider, we should be able to allow people to have other options. So hopefully we will be able to bring Corporation for Supportive Housing in the next few months and help agencies across our state with that.
Katie, we have a question.
Yeah.
Was the Grand Forks community supportive of LaGrave being built?
It was. We were super fortunate. But like I said, it was a community decision. There were a lot of agencies included off the bat when discussions were had back in 2014 and 2015 of, what is our community need? What population is struggling the most? And in that moment, it was individuals experiencing chronic homelessness. We had a lot of providers and the police department around the table saying, hey, like, this population exists. It's not 2,000 people, but it's a population and it's been steady. So yeah, we had a lot of support from a lot of different areas. We were very fortunate. And the police department is still our best friend.
And then kind of a piggyback question, how did the residents in the same neighborhood respond? Community support is sometimes lacking and would love suggestions to increase community support of supportive housing.
Yeah, great question. We did neighborhood meetings. We had interns at the time who went out and did door knocking. A tip I had learned from San Marco and Duluth was to legitimately have your business card and hand it out to people, and kind of establish those relationships. I met personally with people at coffee shops, like people I did not know, and talked to them about their concerns, because it is scary. It's something new, it's different. You wonder what's going on and what you can expect. And so we talk about meeting people where they're at in regards to the clients or the tenants that live at the Great One First. Well, to me, it's no different than the people who are concerned about what you have going on. Truly meeting them where they're at. Okay. And so yes, what does the lease-up process look like? Okay, so I talked about or mentioned that for individuals and families experiencing homelessness, we utilize the North Dakota Continuum of Care's coordinated entry system. So, it's like, in a nutshell, it is a referral system based on the level of need for housing and services. This is well functioning in the Fargo-Moorhead area, and it does work in Grand Forks. It is something that is being expanded into Bismarck currently and being looked at it by a number of other communities in North Dakota. So the cute kit and caboodle of this, there's a lot more to this, but for general basics, someone who's experiencing or at risk of homelessness may present at a shelter in need of a place to stay. So if they are staying there and they are in need of housing and services, they have what's called a VI SPDAT done. It's a lovely self-reported assessment which determines the level of need for housing and services. It looks at 6 different sectors, including things like, people's medical or substance use history, criminal record, housing and homelessness, etc. And so from there, that assessment lines up with a score at the end of it, and the score can either match you with the need for permanent supportive housing, like LaGrave on First, which is, those fairly intense long-term services and supports, or it can then match you with rapid rehousing, like we talked about earlier. That's that short-term rental assistance and the short-term case management, or some people may be able to self-resolve or overcome their situation with little to no help at all, or maybe just a couple of mainstream benefits. So when units open up at LaGrave on First, people are then offered the opportunity to move in based on who's the most in need. So it's not a first come, first serve system. It truly is based off of the level of need of the individual, both in their assessment score, but as well as like that history of homelessness, like how long they've experienced homelessness. And, you know, somebody who's unsheltered may be prioritized over somebody who is, you know, staying in a shelter, or somebody who is at a hotel with a voucher or something like that. So vulnerability is definitely a determining factor in there. So once somebody is offered that opportunity, you know, then the property's eligibility criteria and that process takes over. If deemed eligible, they do go ahead and move in. All of this is done within a database called the Homeless Management Information System. And so that's a pretty complex and robust system that captures a whole lot of data and helps agencies provide services like housing as well. So like I mentioned before, you know, there is definitely opportunity to expand permanent supportive housing and even rapid rehousing throughout the state. So the North Dakota Continuum of Care is currently or is now led by the North Dakota Housing Finance Agency. Previously, it was under the North Dakota Coalition for Homeless People, and it's since, oh, I can't even quite remember, November of last year, so almost a year maybe. They have officially had accepted becoming the lead agency for that HUD program, and they have a Continuum of Care coordinator now. Her name's Chanel Willer, and she's fabulous. And I did not put that up on the screen, but her contact information, if you were to ever be interested in, you know, either becoming a provider of services for supportive housing or having units, you know, maybe start out with 1 or 2 rather than a full property, be included in supportive housing in the coordinated entry system. Chanel Willer is the gal to contact, and her email is smwiller, WILLER, at nd.gov, or her phone number is 701-328-8043. And with that, so lovely summary. Permanent supportive housing is permanent, affordable housing paired with voluntary services that help people stay housed. And those services are tailored to each tenant's wants and needs. And it's supposed to be as normal as possible. Permanent supportive housing is not institutional. It's not a place where we monitor people's activities like a halfway house or a treatment center would. Staff are there to engage and help the tenants live their best life, and all of their goals are different. Living another day is pretty big for some of our tenants, and getting a job and paying rent is also pretty incredible for some tenants. So that is all I have. If there are any other questions.
We do have a few. Who provides the meals, and does everyone come and eat together?
Yeah, so we actually, we have several different churches and organizations that have volunteers that come and provide the meals. So like we utilize the Great Plains Food Bank, I believe, for some of the cost of food, but otherwise it's all volunteer led. We have a program director at LaGrave on First, and she helps just oversee and coordinate some of that. But yes, so and so we have 42 tenants, and I believe anywhere from like 25 to 30 of them will eat in the evenings. Is that the first question?
Yep.
Okay.
Are people more likely to see the on-site nurse rather than go to an appointment at the clinic?
Yes, yes. And it's not funny, but it's even hard sometimes if when so the doctors come every other Wednesday in the afternoons, and so Corrine, our ultra nurse, will assign appointments for some of our tenants, and even to get them to come downstairs sometimes is incredibly difficult. She kicks butt at it and is really good about reminding tenants, calling them, and the best part about having a single site is you can go knock on their door if they allow that. So yes, but the likelihood of people coming down and meeting with that doctor and initiating that care is substantially better than, you know, trying to align transportation and ensure that somebody makes it to the right place through the building, you know, checks in. And a lot of the times folks might have a hard time waiting or being patient. So yeah, definitely successful having our nurse on site, the best.
Do you have a wait list for LaGrave? If so, how long?
Yeah, so we use the hardest part about LaGrave on First is, I shouldn't say the hardest, but one of the more difficult things is the fact that we use the coordinated entry system. So right now we know that there are more people who are in need of permanent supportive housing than units we have available. So it's not a waiting list because it's not a first come, first serve. We're truly, like, when we go and have the next person selected from HMIS to fill a unit at LaGrave on First, we are picking the most or the highest need person based on those coordinated entry policies. So the time frame is the hardest thing to tell somebody, you know, when they're having a VI SPDAT done with a provider, service provider, and not being able to tell them, you know, that they'll have, you know, yep, 1 month from now you can get in. It's just kind of based on turnover. So for Grand Forks, all of our providers that do VI SPDATs, those assessment sites, they know this. They're very well versed in it, and they help people apply for other housing opportunities, whether it's the Grand Forks Housing Authority managed property or something out in the market.
Have you had tenants move out and into other units after staying at LaGrave?
Yes, we have. Yep. So yes, permanent supportive housing, permanent, but like people move on. Some people, like, we're only 2 years in, but when I've been able to visit other projects like LaGrave on First, whether it be San Marco and Duluth or several different places in Chicago or LA, they have what's called like a moving on process. And so some people are going to choose to stay there for a long time because it's a sense of security and safety. It's something they've become familiar with after having a fairly chaotic life. And other people are going to either, you know, after a year or however long they may choose, they might decide that they don't need as many supports right around them, or they might want to move back closer to family and friends if they've been able to like reestablish those relationships. So all of the above is normal and acceptable to us. You know, when we talk about tenancy rates, like, yes, you want to see, you know, 98% tenancy rate is great, but the reality is every tenant is different, and that's okay too. So we're going to just help support them in whatever they want to do.
Can children live with a parent that is in LaGrave or living at LaGrave?
So the way it's set up is to select individuals experiencing chronic homelessness. We have not yet had that example arise, to my knowledge. So, I mean, fair housing wise, I don't think we would be able to say no because people are able to add on household members. But it has not happened yet, to my knowledge.
Can you go more in depth about Winterland and how it works, how the families are referred, etc.?
Yes, so we currently or to date, we have not utilized coordinated entry for Winterland. The referrals have been coming from my knowledge, and I'm not overly involved in Winterland, but we have had referrals come from like the school district for families with children experiencing homelessness. Ideally, if you did it via coordinated entry, it would be the same as what LaGrave on First is doing. So a family would have a VI SPDAT, completed, and based on a few different factors, including that VI-SPDAT score, they would be selected and then brought through our eligibility process and move in accordingly.
Piggyback off that one, why have you not used coordinated entry for Winterland?
That's something I was just talking to my boss about the other week. So it's on our docket of something to do. Right now in Grand Forks, no other housing providers have permanent supportive housing for families. So kind of like LaGrave on First, we'd be the only kit and caboodle, which isn't a terrible thing, but it's just that to date, no service providers have had VI-SPDAT done on families. So it would be just like starting up LaGrave on First. We would have to get our service providers that do VI-SPDATs with families on board and have them start completing those assessments in order to get kind of build up a waiting list. Not a waiting list, but to fill those units. So just something we have to work on yet.
What does the name LaGrave mean?
LaGrave on First. So actually that came from Royce LaGrave. He used to be very involved in affordable housing. And I'm gonna draw a blank right now. I'm gonna blame pregnancy brain, but I wanna say he was in the 70s. I can't quite remember. But it's after Royce LaGrave, and he was definitely an advocate for affordable housing. And on First is, our address is 500 First Avenue. So LaGrave on First.
Is there another LaGrave being built to take care of the need?
There isn't. We've talked about it, and honestly, scattered site supportive housing is what we need. And as I've said a million times now, having the appropriate and sufficient support services readily available is what we need in order to have scattered site supportive housing. And at this moment, we just don't have that. So that's why we're super excited about things like the 1915I. We hope we're able to expand services in communities, Grand Forks for sure. We're definitely there and advocating for that, but also for communities across the state. Because supportive housing doesn't work without services, nor does it work without housing.
How many homeless families have you housed at Winterland?
I cannot tell you off the top. I apologize. If you'd like to reach out to me, I can get that information for you.
And let's see, there's, I think just maybe a, somebody commented, Winterland started with 17 original families and has processed through a few rentals at a time as people have left the program by moving on their own or receiving a voucher for the unit they were currently residing in.
Awesome. I'm assuming that's somebody from the Housing Authority. I can't.
Yeah.
Thanks for whoever answered that. I appreciate you.
Is the Edwinton and Bismarck a supportive housing as well?
Yes, it is. As is Cooper House in Fargo. We just operate a little differently.
Let's see here. The individual who commented on Winterland said, I'm the homeless family's children case manager at Winterland.
Fame.
Fame, yes.
Thanks, Fame.
What experience have you had at LaGrave with feeling you need to issue notices to leave or with the eviction process?
Yeah, it definitely happens. We've had individuals, get behind on rent, and that's one of those, it's a right and responsibility of getting to live at LaGrave on First, is you're still responsible for paying your portion of rent unless you're on a hardship. So it is a conversation that, the property manager has with the individual. It's a conversation that our program director has with the individual. It's a conversation that that case manager from Community Options has with the case manager. I mean, everybody is having these conversations that is involved in the care of that person. And so, you know, sometimes it's an easy conversation, sometimes it's really difficult. For the most part, the notice to evict has come from like those 30-day notice to evict has come from cleanliness concerns. That's one way that we've actually been able to property manager and service providers to say, like, hey, we are super concerned about the cleanliness of your apartment. Like, you couldn't get evicted for this kind of having this kind of mess or whatever the case may be. And so that's an opportunity for service providers to step in and help work with somebody. Otherwise, we have, I believe, only had one true eviction that went through the court process. Kind of at the end of the day, it's a safety concern. Is it safe for you, and is it safe for others for you to be here? So they're difficult situations, and you want to continue to support somebody in making better decisions or figuring life out in an apartment, but sometimes LaGrave on First isn't the right fit, and that's okay.
I think there is one more, Katie. Somebody was wondering if you could share the behavioral health link again.
Oh, yes.
That one? You can even just Google it. There's a lot of good information on that bad boy.
And I'm not sure if you're able to speak to this, but I know when LaGrave first started, the tenants had created a group that was providing money to the homeless and giving back to the community. Can you talk about that a little bit? Or?
Yeah, that was a group that was formed, and yes, they were, raising some funding through candy sales or like concession type sales and things like that, and they were helping support other individuals in the community that were experiencing homelessness, in particular unsheltered homelessness. So that group has evolved now, and they are the homeless helpers. I believe that's their title still. And so they've actually created a 501c3 and have changed leadership a little bit. But yeah, they're still active in our community, helping out folks who are still struggling and don't have access to shelter.
And those residents who were able to be placed as residents in the LaGrave, so giving back to their after they received housing.
Yep.
Okay, I think that is the last of the questions. So thank you so much, Katie. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing your information.
Yeah, you're welcome. Happy to be here. Hope you guys learned a little bit. If you have questions, please reach out. I'm happy to share our experiences. LaGrave on First isn't perfect, but damn, it's pretty close. We try really hard. So.
And for those of you that attended today's session, there will be an email with a survey coming out here in a little while. And if you could please fill that out. Any feedback for us is great as we continue these trainings. So yeah, that should be coming out here shortly to you. So just please take a few minutes and fill that out. That'd be great.
Give it to me straight. I've never done a Zoom presentation like this before, so.
Thanks, Katie.
Okay, thanks guys. Have a great day.
You
Bye-bye.
too.
Thanks everybody for attending.